一提到殖民主義咧，我諗好自然，好多朋友會有一個負面嘅感覺。呢個其實好合理嘅，因為殖民管治本身係存在好多唔合理同唔公義嘅地方。不過我哋係咪單純可以用剝削兩個字咧，就形容宗主國同殖民地之間嘅互動呢？又或者咁，香港戰後同英國嘅關係又究竟係一回咩嘅事呢？今日我哋專程嚟到約揾長期研究香港經濟史嘅 Professor David Clayton 嚟同我哋分析一下。
So Poppy on the left, Megan on the right, yeah, depending on which footed you are.
Yeah, my name is David Clayton. I grew up in the northeast of England, just north of Newcastle, and I then went to the University of Manchester, where I studied a degree in economics and history, and I did my PhD at Manchester, and now I work at the University of York in the Department of History. Yeah, my mother wanted me to be a scholar. My father wanted me to be a footballer. And for the first 10 years, I think my father won out. I was an obsessive footballer. I played every day. I played all day. My youngest daughter, Megan, who's aged 11, plays for a local grassroots team in Leeds, and I'm a volunteer coach, and it has taken over my life. I'm a part-time academic and a full-time football coach.
Yep, on the thigh, and then yes, well, good defending, yep.
So David, what exactly bring you to the study of Hong Kong history? Why you find Hong Kong in general interesting for you?
I've been asked that question many times, and I have a very strange answer, and it relates to the toys in front of us, really. My theory here is that as a child in the 1970s, I was wearing many kind of clothes, often cheap clothes that would have been made in Hong Kong, and I was also playing with toys that would have been made in Hong Kong, and I have one here from the 1970s, and it has sort of made in Hong Kong stamped on the bottom, wow, which is quite unusual. Most toys would not be sort of stamped.
I have some of this myself too.
But at the same time, textile manufacturers, clothing manufacturers and toy manufacturers in the UK were suffering. So I think that got me interested in sort of what's explaining this, really. Why did Hong Kong industrialise? Why did Britain deindustrialise? And they're still the questions which I'm trying to answer.
But Hong Kong's success, in a way, lead to a lot of conflicts with Britain, right? Because of our export, as you say, that really affecting the home market, right? So was the relationship between Britain and Hong Kong at least in the economic sense, quite tense in the post-war period?
By the late 40s, there was already a backlash against kind of Hong Kong manufacturers. British kind of manufacturers were demanding kind of protection from cheap goods coming in from the Asian kind of Commonwealth, because these were goods were coming in without incurring a sort of tariff, which made them sort of remarkably sort of cheap in UK markets. And there was also an argument that these goods were exploiting kind of workers. So these workers were not just paid lowly, but they were working in insanitary conditions for long hours, and the whole system of kind of capitalism in Hong Kong was exploitative. And they needed to be kind of regulated, needed to be controlled. But first and foremost, British manufacturers, textile manufacturers in Lancashire, clothing manufacturers all over the country, toy manufacturers wanted kind of protection. They wanted a sort of change in that relationship between Britain and Hong Kong.
But there were also a further tension or controversy between the centre and the periphery over the currency exchange rate. Right, when London decided to devalue the pound sterling in the 60s, it really created a big mess with the relationship with Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, I think that's a big symbolic moment. It's symbolically important because Hong Kong wasn't sort of pre-warned of the devaluation, and the assets that Hong Kong had built up and held in sort of sterling in London were consequently kind of devalued by political decision to devalue the currency in 67. I mean, that's arguably in Britain's interests, and people on the left would say that should have occurred much sooner. Devaluation was left too long. Hong Kong people said they weren't informed, so there's a political imbalance.
Given all these tensions over economic matters, export and currency, how did the Hong Kong government tried to defend or pursue the interests during this period? Did they make a lot of lobbying efforts or PR efforts to try to make a best case of themselves in Britain?
So there's a concerted effort to deal with the protectionist backlash overseas, and that includes soft propaganda promoting Hong Kong goods. It includes kind of securing influential business people to travel overseas, to talk to business people, to talk to politicians. So there's a huge effort going on to tell the Hong Kong story in the 1950s and into the 1960s as a success story, as a story of rising employment, rising opportunity for people, many of whom were escapees from communist China. So they're trying to sort of create a narrative overseas that Hong Kong is an unusual colony and people are benefiting not from being under colonial rule, but from benefiting from a system of sort of free trade.
So far, our discussion is very much about the tension, misunderstanding or confrontation between London and Hong Kong. But is it too simplistic to say that, okay, this kind of imperial relationship is basically an exploitative one?
The example of kind of labour laws kind of is illustrative. So Britain was pressurising Hong Kong to introduce more progressive labour laws. There's been a push since the 1930s which strengthens through the 40s and 50s to expand labour protections in Hong Kong as well as in other colonies. So this begins with encouraging the colonial administration to reform trade union laws, so to encourage Chinese labour organisations to register as trade unions to get protections under the law so that they can strike legally. And then that continues through the 40s and 50s with the extension of the setting of minimum statutory standards of hours of work, access to sick pay, holiday entitlements. So there's an attempt to kind of equalise kind of the playing field between the UK and higher income kind of countries and Hong Kong, and to extend kind of protections to Hong Kong workers. Employers argue that workers don't want these, don't need them. There are benevolent bureaucrats in Hong Kong that disagree, to say that workers do need these kind of protections. And UK governments, particularly Labour governments in the UK, push the issue. Notably so after the 1966 and 67 riots, because they're perceived to have been partly caused by sort of dissatisfaction in Hong Kong about labour conditions. So there's a big push, obviously, after sort of 67 to improve labour standards in Hong Kong.
So in a way that what we saw in this reform in the labour welfare, labour rights in the colony in the post-war period, or particularly in the 60s and 70s, London turned out to be, in fact, a major source of momentum.
Agreed. Again, that's certainly the case for Labour governments, but also for kind of Conservative governments. It's a basic principle in which if your goods are allowed in to a market relatively freely without the imposition of tariffs or other kind of infringements, non-tariff barriers, then what tends to kind of happen is that there's an attempt to level the playing field.
Lastly, that you have been teaching and researching on Hong Kong economic history for more than 20 years, right? Did you see a change in the focus of interest in Hong Kong history over the years?
Yes, I have. So we have that older generation who are nostalgic for empire, including for Britain's holding on to places like Hong Kong. Since then, over the last 5 years, you've seen a younger generation, people in the teens and 20s, having a much more critical view of the empire and of colonialism as a project, seeing that as something which only did bad things. It repressed people, terrorized people, exploited people. And again, I think that's a simplification. And what it can often lead to is a way of judging people in the past who were part of an imperial project. Instead of trying to understand what the empire did and how it did it and why it did it and what the consequences were, there's a sort of a attempt just to say wherever empire was created, it did bad things, it exploited people. So I think that's a simple view which needs to be kind of corrected as well. I mean, Hong Kong is a very interesting sort of place, but most people in the UK don't know much about it. But what they have obviously focused on the last few years has been the protests against the erosion of rights.
睇完 David 嘅訪問咧，大家可能都會發現到作為歷史研究嘅興趣，最大嘅樂趣咧係在於可以透過新嘅材料、新嘅角度咧去重新理解過去，去完善、去補充以往一啲嘅既定睇法。一代一代嘅歷史學者咧，其實好似跑街場接力賽，一步一步咁不停為我哋尋找對歷史更具說服力嘅解說。
Abby, then you think the next pass is going to go to Megan, otherwise they're going to get 2 points. Yep. So you're trying to interview for the pass. Yep. Yep. So you've got more time than they think you've got, girls. Yeah, much more time. That's really good. And someone needs to support Megan.